Pastor Emmanuel was loved and respected in Glory Light Ministry. His deep sermons, smooth voice, and ability to connect with people made him a household name. Everyone in the community looked up to him as a man of God who lived an upright life. But what they didn't know was that Pastor Emmanuel had a secret. A secret that could destroy everything he had worked so hard to build. Away from the pulpit and the eyes of his congregation, Pastor Emmanuel had another life. For the past 2 years, he had been in a relationship with Cynthia, a young woman in her late 20s. She was beautiful, confident, and everything that Pastor Emmanuel found exciting but couldn't find in his wife, Evelyn. Cynthia made him feel alive, like a young man with no responsibilities. It all started innocently enough. Pastor Emmanuel had counseled Cynthia when she was going through a tough breakup. She came to him broken and vulnerable, seeking comfort. At first, their relationship was purely pastoral, but one evening after a late counseling session, emotions took over. Cynthia leaned into him for a hug, and before he knew it, he was drawn into her charm. They began meeting secretly, away from the church. Emmanuel rented a small apartment in the outskirts of town where they could spend time together without being seen. At first, he felt guilty, but the thrill of sneaking around made him justify his actions. He convinced himself that as long as he continued to serve the church and his wife never found out, he wasn't doing any real harm. Cynthia was madly in love with Pastor Emmanuel. She admired his charisma, his ability to command respect, and the way he made her feel special. But as time passed, she began to want more. She didn't want to be the secret woman anymore. She wanted to be his only woman. "Emmanuel, when are you going to leave her?" Cynthia would ask after their time together. She was referring to Evelyn, the pastor's wife. "Soon," he would always reply, avoiding eye contact. "I just need more time. Divorce is complicated, and I have my reputation to think about." But Cynthia was tired of hearing the same excuses. She saw how Emmanuel and Evelyn appeared happy in public, and it made her blood boil. She hated the fact that Evelyn still held the title of Mrs. while she had to hide in the shadows. Cynthia wanted to be the one walking hand in hand with him, sitting in the front row of the church as his wife. The breaking point came one Sunday morning when Cynthia decided to attend church. She wanted to see how Pastor Emmanuel interacted with his wife in public. As she sat in the back row, she watched him preaching passionately, and Evelyn sat proudly in the front row, smiling at him. Cynthia felt a lump in her throat as jealousy consumed her. After the service, she approached him in the parking lot. "We need to talk," she whispered, her voice trembling with anger. Evelyn had always been a supportive wife. She was quiet and graceful, the perfect image of a pastor's wife. But she wasn't blind. Over the past year, she had noticed changes in her husband. He stayed out late, claiming to have endless church meetings. He spent more time on his phone, and there were moments when he seemed distracted even during family dinner. One day, she saw a text message pop up on his phone while he was in the shower. The message was from someone named C. It read, "I miss you. Can we meet tonight?" Evelyn's heart sank. She didn't confront him immediately but began watching his behavior more closely. Evelyn confided in her close friend, Sister Margaret, who was also a member of the church. "I don't want to jump to conclusions," Evelyn said, her voice shaky, "but I feel like something isn't right with Emmanuel." "Pray about it," Margaret advised. "And if your spirit doesn't feel at peace, confront him." Evelyn decided to give it more time, hoping that whatever was going on would resolve itself. But deep down, she knew her husband was hiding something. That evening, Cynthia and Pastor Emmanuel met at their usual spot, the small apartment he rented for their secret dealings. Cynthia's mood was different this time. She wasn't playful or flirty like she usually was. Instead, she was cold and distant. "What's wrong?" Emmanuel asked, sensing the tension in the room. "I can't do this anymore," Cynthia snapped. "I'm tired of being your little secret. You promised me you would leave her." "I told you I need more time," Emmanuel replied, his voice low. "You have to be patient." "Patient?" Cynthia's voice rose. "I've been patient for 2 years, Emmanuel. 2 years of hiding, sneaking around, and watching you play the perfect husband in public. Do you know how humiliating that is for me?" "Lower your voice," Emmanuel said, glancing nervously at the door. "The neighbors." "I don't care about the neighbors," Cynthia interrupted. "You're either going to leave her, or I'm leaving you." Cynthia stormed out of the apartment, leaving Emmanuel sitting on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. He knew he was in trouble. Cynthia was no longer the sweet, understanding woman he had fallen for. She had become angry, demanding, and unpredictable. But what could he do? Divorce would ruin his reputation and possibly his position in the church. Yet, he couldn't imagine losing Cynthia either. He felt trapped, like a man walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. The next few weeks were tense. Cynthia became more demanding, calling Emmanuel at odd hours and even threatening to show up at his house. Emmanuel tried to calm her down, but nothing seemed to work. Evelyn, on the other hand, grew more suspicious as her husband became increasingly secretive. One evening, as Evelyn sat alone in the living room, she made up her mind to confront Emmanuel. But before she could, trouble came knocking literally. It was Cynthia. Evelyn had just finished preparing dinner when the doorbell rang. She was surprised to see Cynthia standing on her doorstep, looking uneasy yet determined. Cynthia had always been polite whenever they had crossed paths, but today, something felt different. The air was thick with tension. "Good evening, Sister Evelyn," Cynthia said, her voice a little too calm. "Good evening, Cynthia," Evelyn replied, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. She didn't expect a visit from Cynthia, especially not without Emmanuel. "Is everything okay?" Cynthia hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I need to talk to Emmanuel. It's urgent." Evelyn knew that something wasn't right. Cynthia's expression was cold, and there was a certain desperation in her eyes. She had been suspicious for some time now, but now, the signs were becoming undeniable. "He's not home yet," Evelyn answered, trying to keep her composure. "But I can tell him you stopped by." Cynthia's gaze didn't leave Evelyn's face. "I'll wait. I need to see him." At that moment, a wave of unease washed over Evelyn. Something about Cynthia's insistence made her uncomfortable. The situation felt wrong, but Evelyn couldn't figure out why. She couldn't just throw Cynthia out, so she motioned for her to come inside. "Please, come in," Evelyn said, stepping aside to let Cynthia enter. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound being the faint ticking of the wall clock. Evelyn could feel Cynthia's eyes on her, almost as if she were waiting for something. Meanwhile, Pastor Emmanuel was unaware of the storm that was brewing at home. He had gone out for a late meeting with a few church members, discussing plans for an upcoming revival service. It was the perfect cover. His wife would never suspect him of anything suspicious while he was occupied with church matters. But even as he sat in the meeting, he couldn't shake off the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Cynthia's threats had weighed heavily on him. He had tried to reassure her that everything would work out, but deep down, he knew he had run out of excuses. The pressure was mounting. What was once an exciting secret had turned into a toxic trap. He couldn't lose Cynthia, but at the same time, he couldn't risk losing his family and his position as pastor. He was caught between two worlds, both of them pulling him in different directions. When his phone buzzed, he saw a message from Cynthia. His stomach tightened as the message from Cynthia saying she will be waiting for him sank in. Cynthia was no longer the patient, understanding woman she once was. She had become someone he couldn't control anymore. Back at home, Evelyn was growing more anxious by the minute. She had tried to make small talk with Cynthia, but it was clear that the younger woman wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. Every time Evelyn spoke, Cynthia's gaze remained fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. Suddenly, the door opened, and Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. Pastor Emmanuel walked in, looking surprised to see Cynthia sitting on the couch. "Cynthia," Emmanuel said, his voice tight with tension. "What are you doing here?" "I came to talk to you," Cynthia responded sharply, her eyes narrowing. "You've been avoiding me, Emmanuel. I've waited long enough." Evelyn's heart sank as she watched the exchange. Something was terribly wrong. She stood up, her legs feeling weak beneath her. "What's going on, Emmanuel?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Emmanuel could respond, Cynthia stood up abruptly and walked toward him, her hands trembling with rage. "You promised me you would leave her," Cynthia shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. "But here you are, playing the good husband, the good pastor, while I'm left in the dark." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The truth was finally coming to light. She had suspected, but now, there was no denying it. Emmanuel stepped back, trying to calm Cynthia down. "Cynthia, please. Let's talk about this later, okay?" "Not here." "No," Cynthia snapped, "I've had enough." Her voice was shaking with anger. "You've been lying to me for 2 years, Emmanuel. I've given you everything, and all you've done is promise me things you never kept. You're nothing but a liar." Emmanuel took another step back, his mind racing. "Cynthia, please. Let's go outside and talk about this, okay? Please." But Cynthia wasn't listening. She was too far gone, the jealousy and hurt consuming her. In a moment of madness, Cynthia reached into her bag, her fingers trembling. Emmanuel didn't notice it at first, but Evelyn did. Her heart dropped as she recognized the shape of a small object in Cynthia's hand. Before Evelyn could react, Cynthia pulled out a small handgun and pointed it at Emmanuel. "Enough of your lies!" Cynthia screamed, her eyes wild with rage. Time seemed to slow down for Evelyn. She couldn't believe what was happening. She felt paralyzed, unable to move or speak. Her husband, the man she trusted, the man who had promised her love and faithfulness, was now standing in front of her with a woman who was holding a gun aimed at his chest. "Cynthia, stop!" Emmanuel pleaded, his voice cracking. "Put the gun down. You don't want to do this." But Cynthia's eyes were glazed with fury. "You promised me, Emmanuel. You promised. You're not leaving her, so you're going to pay for it." In a blur of motion, the gunshot rang out, echoing through the room. Evelyn screamed as she saw her husband collapse to the ground, blood pouring from his chest. She rushed to his side, her hands shaking as she tried to stop the bleeding. "Emmanuel! Emmanuel, no!" Cynthia stood frozen for a moment, the gun still in her hand, her chest heaving with the weight of what she had just done. The reality of the situation began to sink in, but it was too late. She had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Evelyn turned to her, her eyes filled with shock and disbelief. You killed him," she cried, her voice barely a whisper. Cynthia dropped the gun to the floor, her hands shaking. She looked at Emmanuel's lifeless body, then at Evelyn, her expression unreadable. "I had no choice," Cynthia said, her voice flat. "He promised me. He lied." Evelyn's cries echoed in the small living room, but Cynthia stood motionless, her expression unreadable. She looked at the gun lying on the floor, her mind racing. What had she done? She hadn't meant for it to go this far. But then again, maybe she had. Evelyn's hands trembled as she tried desperately to stop the bleeding. Emmanuel's once strong frame lay limp on the floor, his life slipping away with every passing second. "Please, Emmanuel," Evelyn whispered through her tears. "Don't leave me." Cynthia looked on, her eyes hollow, as if she were a stranger to herself. She didn't know what to feel. Was she guilty? Or was she simply a woman scorned, pushed too far by Emmanuel's lies and promises? She didn't know the answer. After what felt like an eternity, Evelyn managed to pull herself together, her panic replaced by a raw determination. She grabbed her phone and dialed the emergency number, her voice shaking as she begged for help. "Please. You have to come now. My husband, he's been shot," she cried. "We need help, please." Cynthia took a step back, her fingers still twitching from the tremors that coursed through her body. She wasn't sure what to do. She wanted to run, to escape the consequences of her actions, but her feet wouldn't move. Her eyes locked with Evelyn's, and for a brief moment, she saw the pain in the other woman's eyes. She saw the betrayal, the same betrayal she had felt for years. But it was too late for regrets now. As the sound of sirens grew louder outside, Cynthia made her decision. Without another word, she turned and fled out the door, leaving Evelyn alone with her dying husband. The guilt, the confusion, and the overwhelming sense of loss weighed heavily on her as she ran down the street, her footsteps echoing in the night air. Evelyn knelt beside Emmanuel's body, her hands pressed firmly against his chest, but it was no use. His breathing had slowed, and the blood was pooling beneath him. The life she had built with this man, the father of their children, was slipping away right in front of her. "Please, Emmanuel," she begged again, her voice breaking. "I don't want to lose you." But there was no response. Only the sound of her sobs and the distant wail of approaching sirens. When the paramedics arrived, they rushed in, pushing Evelyn aside as they attempted to revive Emmanuel. But it was clear there was little they could do. The gunshot had been too severe. His chances of survival were slim, and within minutes, they confirmed what Evelyn already knew in her heart: Emmanuel was gone. The weight of his death settled over her like a heavy blanket. She had loved him, trusted him, built a life with him. And now, he was gone. Taken by the woman he had promised so much to, but never fully committed to. Evelyn watched as the paramedics covered Emmanuel's body, their movements quick and practiced, as if they had seen too many scenes like this to be affected by the loss. But for Evelyn, it was different. She wasn't just watching a stranger's tragedy unfold, she was living it. The police arrived soon after, cordoning off the area and beginning their investigation. They questioned Evelyn first, their expression serious as they gathered information. Evelyn answered their questions in a daze, her mind still struggling to grasp what had happened. She told them about Cynthia's sudden arrival, the argument, and the gunshot. She told them about the promises Emmanuel had made, how he had always said he would leave her for Cynthia, but never did. She didn't know what else to say. How could she explain the years of betrayal, the years of deceit, when her heart was shattered into a million pieces? After some time, they took her statement and told her they would need to speak to Cynthia next. Evelyn didn't care anymore. Whatever happened to Cynthia didn't matter to her. Nothing mattered except the fact that her world had come crashing down. She had lost everything. Cynthia didn't go home. She couldn't. She didn't even know where she was running to. The adrenaline of the moment had carried her far away from the scene of the crime, but now, as the night air cooled her heated skin, she realized how much danger she was in. Her phone buzzed with messages from her friends, but she ignored them. Her mind was racing. What was she supposed to do now? The police would be looking for her soon. She couldn't go back to the church. The members would never forgive her for what she had done. The weight of her actions slowly began to hit her. She hadn't just killed Emmanuel. She had destroyed everything, the life she had wanted, the promises he had made, the future they could have had together. It was all gone now. And for what? A moment of anger, a moment of betrayal? She found herself standing on a quiet street, staring at the ground, lost in thought. But the reality was sinking in. She was alone. She had nothing left. She couldn't stay in the city anymore. Her face would be all over the news, and people would be looking for her. She needed to leave. And so, Cynthia ran. Back in the house, Evelyn stood in the doorway, watching as the police continued their investigation. Her mind was numb, her heart aching with the realization that the man she had loved, the man she had given everything to, was never truly hers. She had trusted Emmanuel with her life, with her heart, and he had thrown it all away for someone else. But now, he was gone, and nothing would ever be the same again. The pain of betrayal, of losing someone she had devoted herself to for so many years, was unbearable. But there was one thing she knew for sure: she would never let this woman, Cynthia, get away with what she had done. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she had to find justice for Emmanuel, even if it meant facing the darkest truths of their relationship. As the night wore on, Evelyn sat by herself, staring at the empty space where her husband once Saturday. The house felt cold and unfamiliar now, a place that had once been filled with love and warmth, now a reminder of the man who had shattered her world. Days passed, and the shock of Emmanuel's death began to settle into a cold reality for Evelyn. The house that once echoed with laughter and the warmth of family now felt like a tomb. She spent most of her time in a numb daze, her thoughts consumed by the questions that lingered in her mind. Why had Emmanuel been so careless? Why had he lied to her for so long, promising to leave Cynthia when he never intended to? But above all, she couldn't shake the image of the woman who had taken everything from her. Cynthia. The police were still investigating, but they had little to go on. Cynthia had disappeared, and no one knew where she had gone. The authorities were doing their best to track her down, but Evelyn knew that finding her wouldn't be as simple as it seemed. Cynthia was clever, and she had always managed to keep herself out of the spotlight. But Evelyn couldn't let her escape. She had to face the woman who had destroyed her life, the woman who had taken her husband away. Evelyn couldn't keep waiting. She couldn't just sit in this house and let Cynthia slip through her fingers. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that Emmanuel's death wasn't just about betrayal. It was about power. Emmanuel had been living two lives, and for far too long, he had played both Evelyn and Cynthia like pawns. And now, he was gone, leaving both women to deal with the consequences of his actions. Evelyn decided she would find Cynthia herself. She didn't care if the police were already looking for her. She couldn't wait around, helpless and broken. She had to do something. Her hands trembled as she gathered what little information she had about Cynthia. She had seen the woman around town many times, but never in the kind of detail that would help her track her down. But Evelyn was determined. She knew Cynthia's background, knew where she had come from, even if she didn't know her every move. She spent hours calling friends, colleagues, and anyone who might have information. She couldn't stop now, not when she was so close to finding the answers. Cynthia, on the other hand, was not as calm as she appeared. The thrill of escaping the scene of the crime had quickly worn off, and now fear gnawed at her from every direction. She couldn't trust anyone. The people who had once admired her were now looking for her. The police, the community, even her own family, none of them knew where she was. She had thought running away would give her the freedom she craved, but now she realized how wrong she had been. She was a fugitive. And no matter how far she ran, she knew she couldn't outrun the truth. She had killed a man. And not just any man, she had killed Emmanuel, the pastor who had promised to marry her but never did. Cynthia found herself on a bus, traveling to a distant city, trying to escape the crushing weight of her own actions. She tried to block out the guilt that consumed her, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Emmanuel's lifeless body on the floor. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape him. She stayed in cheap motels, hiding from the world and hoping no one would recognize her. The only thing that kept her going was the thought that maybe, just maybe, she could start over. She could leave everything behind. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. She was being hunted. And no matter how far she ran, she would never be free of the mess she had created. Evelyn's search for Cynthia led her to an old apartment building on the outskirts of the city. A few people she had spoken to had mentioned seeing a woman matching Cynthia's description in the area. She could feel the weight of the moment, the intensity of what she was about to do. Her hands were sweaty as she approached the building. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. When she reached the door of the apartment, she hesitated. Her heart raced in her chest as she considered what might happen once she faced Cynthia. Would she fight back? Would she admit what she had done? Would Evelyn finally get the answers she so desperately needed? Evelyn knocked on the door. She waited, her breath shallow, her nerves on edge. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and there stood Cynthia. For a split second, they simply stared at each other, neither woman saying a word. Then, finally, Cynthia spoke. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice hoarse and guarded. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, the anger rising in her chest. "I want to know why you did it," she said quietly. "Why did you kill him? What was it all for? All the lies, all the promises, and for what?" Cynthia's eyes flickered with something that could have been guilt, but it quickly faded, replaced by a cold, detached expression. "He promised me he would leave you. He promised he would marry me. But he never did." Evelyn could feel the rage building inside her. "So you killed him," she spat. "You killed the man I loved, the father of my children, because he didn't keep a promise. You destroyed everything." Cynthia's eyes darkened, and she stepped closer to Evelyn. "You don't understand," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "He was never going to leave you. He played us both for fools. But I couldn't wait forever. I had to make him pay for his lies." Evelyn shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "And now he's dead. And so are you, Cynthia. Your life is over." Cynthia's face twisted with anger. "You think I care?" she snapped. "He was nothing to me, just a man who used me. And now I'm free. I'm free of him, free of all the lies, and I'm free of you." For a moment, the room was filled with tense silence. Neither woman knew what would happen next. But one thing was clear, the death of Emmanuel had changed everything. And neither Evelyn nor Cynthia would ever be the same again. The silence in the apartment was deafening. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she stood face to face with the woman who had taken everything from her. The weight of the moment settled between them like a storm ready to explode. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The words that had been building up for weeks seemed to hang in the air, thick with tension. Cynthia's cold, hardened expression never wavered. She stood tall, her eyes flashing with defiance. But Evelyn could see the cracks in her facade, the fear, the regret, the uncertainty that Cynthia had tried so hard to bury. Evelyn's anger flared, but it was tinged with something else. Pity. You're running from what you've done, Evelyn said quietly, her voice steady despite the rage inside. You're hiding, hoping that if you keep running, maybe you can outrun the guilt. But you can't. Cynthia's eyes narrowed, her fists clenched at her sides. I don't need your pity, she spat. I did what I had to do. He lied to me, betrayed me, just like he betrayed you. You think you're the only one who suffered? Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat, her voice softer now. You're right. He lied to both of us. But I didn't have to kill him. I didn't have to destroy everything for revenge. Cynthia stepped back, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she admitted, her voice shaking. I just wanted him to feel the pain he caused. But when the gun went off, I didn't know what I was doing. And now I can't undo it. He's gone. Evelyn's eyes softened, but only for a moment. She had no sympathy left for Cynthia. The damage had been done, and no amount of regret could fix what had been shattered. You took him from me. And now, you'll pay for it. Cynthia took a shaky step back, realizing the truth in Evelyn's words. Her bravado was crumbling, and for the first time, she saw the consequences of her actions clearly. But Evelyn wasn't interested in her remorse anymore. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Evelyn knew the police were close. She had already called them when she arrived at the apartment, hoping this confrontation would finally bring closure. Cynthia's face turned pale, panic flooding her system. You called them? She asked, her voice rising in panic. No, please, don't. I can't go back. Evelyn simply nodded, her expression hardening. It's over, Cynthia. You can run all you want, but you'll never escape what you've done. As the door burst open and the police stormed in, Cynthia was handcuffed, her world crashing down around her. The woman who had once been so confident now looked fragile, broken by the truth she had been trying to outrun. Evelyn watched as Cynthia was led away, her heart heavy but finally at peace. The pain of losing Emmanuel would never go away, but at least now, she knew the truth. There would be no more lies, no more secrets. She had faced the woman who had stolen her life, and now, Evelyn could begin the long process of healing. In the end, Cynthia's revenge had only cost her everything. And Evelyn, though scarred, was finally free.